My name is John Zakian. I'm living the life of what economic development does. I've actually formed my own consulting corporation called Zakian Consulting, and my current focus is in post-disaster long-term community recovery with a focus on businesses and economic development. Well, it really began right after Katrina. The International Economic Development Council, to their credit, partnered with the Economic Development Administration and received, I believe it was around an $800,000 grant. And the purpose of the grant was to fund IEDC members to cover their living costs, but to go into Mississippi and Louisiana and even parts of Texas and work with businesses, business organizations, economic development organizations, and local governments to help them put together long-term community recovery plans that would be implemented over a 10, 15-year period. People have come to realize that Katrina really was probably one of the worst disasters in this nation's experience, although there have been some as bad. And it really was a test of the ability to recover and even become more resilient going forward. And one of the key areas was in economic development. I was the guinea pig, as Jeff would say. I was the first volunteer for IEDC, and I spent a lot of time in Mississippi and Louisiana, along the Gulf Coast, New Orleans, Hancock County, Mississippi, and employed all my economic development skills and also my background in city and county management combined to work with a number of local organizations to help them piece together long-term community recovery plans. And out of that, it morphed into a profession. Well, the best way I describe trying to capture any disaster, and just as an aside, thanks to IEDC, that was the first role I played. We've been involved in responding to massive flooding, like in Iowa. We responded to the wildfires in San Diego a few years ago, multiple hurricanes. I've also been involved in responding to the horrible tornadoes that ripped through Alabama in 2011. You cannot begin to fathom the depth of devastation and impact that Mother Nature has when she sends out disasters. And I think the image that constantly is reinforced in my mind is just sitting down with people, whoever they may are. You go in with this energy thinking, okay, I'm coming down to save the world. And you start talking to people and you realize that what they really want to do in the beginning is just talk. Have somebody listen to them, tell them what, for instance, businesses, what a small business, what they were like before the storm, what the storm meant in terms of how devastating it was, how it impacted not only their business, but their personal lives. In an area like Katrina and its depth and breadth of devastation, when you were trying to work with business executives or even economic development organizations, within minutes you realize that you're not only looking at the organization or the business, but in most cases, their employees themselves, the executives of the EDOs, they had lost their homes. So you were not only talking about one aspect of their life, but you were talking about their whole life. And what we as economic development professionals had to suddenly realize is that our profession is not necessarily limited to job creation or helping businesses grow. We actually can be involved in the entire social fabric of life. The depth of the devastation was so much that those of us that went down as volunteers for these various storms, hurricanes, natural disasters, we met with hundreds of people, businesses, organizations, and it was literally almost triage. So in that respect, I've been disappointed that I haven't really been able to follow through with the individual businesses. However, the positive side is I have stayed connected with a number of the organizations, especially the economic development organizations with which I was involved. And it's been fantastic to see how they literally started. I can think of several organizations that not only lost their personal homes, but they lost their offices. They were operating out of trailers themselves. The first 4 or 5 months, they had, not even the basics. They had no phone service. And to see them now, not only have they recovered from where they were, but they've continued to grow and expand. the key thing, if anyone is going to get involved, and I've encouraged other colleagues in the International Economic Development Council that it's worth the time and effort to take your expertise into the hardest hit areas, regardless of what the disaster is. The key thing is to go in with a blank slate. Don't assume anything, and be patient and take into account. The best thing to do is to observe first and listen. What I learned in Katrina after my first trip down there, which was kind of a learning experience, was that every time I went down, I would usually go down for periods of 1 to 2 weeks. And the first couple of days, I would literally do almost no talking, unless I was asked questions in which I would give them the best answers I could. But what I tried to do was spend time traveling around, getting a sense of what the real impact was, physical and mental and emotional. And then I would listen to people to get a real grasp of the challenges they were facing. And then work from there and begin to work through a process, talking with them what they wanted to do, where they wanted to go. I think the best example, going back to your question about have I stayed in touch with anyone, New Orleans has one of the preeminent children's museums in the country. And it should be noted that when IEDC went into this post-disaster recovery efforts, we didn't limit it to just businesses. We also worked with nonprofit organizations because at the end of the day, nonprofits are a huge economic development engine. So I met with them in their headquarters, which is in the heart of the city of New Orleans. There was a blue tarp on the roof. The entire interior had been totally soaked and wiped out and flooded. And I met with the executive director and the chairperson of the board, and they originally said, we don't know how we're going to do this. And I listened to them, and they had been personally affected. But then they started saying, but our mission is to help children, to give them a safe haven, so we have to rebuild. So then we started talking about not only rebuilding where they were, but the plans they had had prior to Katrina and what they wanted to do. And we worked through this whole process, literally putting together a 10-year plan. It's now more than 10 years later, and I'm very proud of the fact that the Louisiana Children's Museum continues to be one of the most preeminent children's museums in the country. It clearly is a cultural and social anchor in the city of New Orleans, and it is probably 3 or 4 times more robust today than it was pre-Katrina. And a lot of it was just taking the time to map out strategies piece by piece, making it clear that recovery is not, let me take a step back, because I think one of the biggest things to realize is that everybody, it's a natural human instinct. If Mother Nature takes everything away from you within, let's say, less than a day, you want to rebuild it in less than a day. And the reality is that isn't going to happen. Unfortunately, what Mother Nature wrought is going to take up to 10 years. So part of what I do is when I listen, I let them kind of vent, go through the whole process, and I said, okay, here, let's start working out a plan. But I said, you've got to realize and not get discouraged that what took 1 day to destroy is going to take 10 years to recover. And once that begins to sink in, then they have benchmarks. And the Louisiana Children's Museum is one example of they clearly met their benchmarks. And they've met everyone and exceeded everyone. And they really are a thriving, proud institution in the city of New Orleans. I would say as a profession, and it's really unsung, and it's not just because I was involved, but there have been hundreds of members of IEDC and others that, that we'd like to be members that aren't members, that have given of themselves and given up their time, and not just weeks, but months, in going into areas hard hit from disasters. And unfortunately, every year there are new disasters. And they really have, rolled up their sleeves, and they've worked with businesses, they've worked with nonprofit organizations, with the economic development organizations that have been affected, to help them put together recovery plans. And I think one of the proudest achievements is that, for the profession, is that we're not selfish. And there's a reason for that. I love telling people that if you're going to get into economic development, if you do really well, you'll have a decent salary, but you're not in the profession to make a ton of money. So part of what your passion has to be is that you're going in to help people. And clearly part of that is responding to disasters after they happen. One of the greatest values right now for IEDC is the Certified Economic Development Program, which is what this little pin here represents. It gives you a framework for becoming, for training and becoming identified as a credentialed economic development professional. You go back 90 years ago, and the original pioneers, which I was not one, really had to create the profession and set the standards because it didn't exist. I came into economic development from a city-county management background. I had an opportunity to take on a new role running an economic development agency, and I seized it. IEDC was my source of value, not only in terms of learning what it meant to be an economic development professional, but also in terms of learning the nuances, the different frameworks, the different opportunities, the different challenges, and the different ways to approach promoting economic development in a community, and actually what economic development meant. And in its 90 years, it has continued to take the lead in further defining the profession, for keeping that passion that is so important, to imbue that in all of the economic development professionals, to make them realize that this really is, everything you do on a daily basis affects people. And our goal is to make sure it's always positive. And if you look at it today versus 90 years ago, it has improved light years in terms of standards, recognition, and value. You have to take a step back. I'll give you, one of the challenges in economic development, now wearing my normal hat, not my post-disaster recovery hat, is that a lot of economic development, you sow the seeds, and it can take years for it to be created. I'm localizing this, but anybody in the New York City area will probably know this. I was an economic development professional in the Westchester County area, and there was this huge dump. It was a dump that sat off the New York State Thruway. And it took 10 years to bring it around and clean it up, and then it took another 5 years to convince the private sector to invest and build in it. It's now one of only 3 Stu Leonard's supermarkets, which is like a major regional attraction. It's the site of a Home Depot. It's the site of, I believe, a Costco. That is a job generator. Those 3 alone create 1,000 jobs for the city I worked in, which was Yonkers, and for the area. It took 15 years. What the economic development profession has to realize, again, is that we're in this for the long haul, and that real, measurable, achievable economic development takes time. And what we have to do is make sure that we keep a focus on the fact that our role is to help other people. And in order for that to take place, we're in a very challenging environment. There's always going to be new obstacles, and what is expected of us as professionals is to find the ways to overcome those obstacles. What's next in the next 90 years? Well, first of all, it is important to not sit on our laurels. There are a lot of successes for this organization. It has a lot to be proud of. Don't forget that this used to be 2 organizations, both of whom were really effective in representing the economic development profession, but to the credit of the leadership of both, they realized that to even take this to the next level, they had to be a merger. And what you have now is probably the strongest professional organization of any type in the United States, and now morphing into international. So the key is never lose sight of your foundation. And the Certified Economic Development Program is one of the key achievements for IEDC, because it does give us a credential which is increasingly being recognized as demonstrating the highest quality in the profession and the importance of economic development. I would say going forward, that needs to continue to be built upon. There continues to be a challenge, many times unspoken and unrecognized, that the economic development profession continues to have some mystery. It doesn't surprise me, but my first day here at the conference, I rode up an elevator with a few young people, and they said, they saw the name tag and everything, and they said, "Oh, you're an economist." And I had 2 reactions, one of which was in my head. The other one I verbalized. The one I verbalized was a lot cleaner and nicer and friendlier. And I said, no, there's a huge difference between an economist and an economic developer. I said, I will tell you what an economic developer does. I will not tell you what I think an economist does. I said, an economic developer's role is to identify needs and challenges in a community and a region to help them sustain their growth in the future and then work through for solutions. I think that message needs to continue to resonate and continue to be built. I think there needs to be, and again, to the credit of IEDC in its 90th year, it is increasingly doing this. We need to further engage elected officials, appointed officials like the International City County Management Association, where there is a good synergy relationship between IEDC. There are a number of different organizations and different professions within state, local, and county governments that we need to continue to reach out to and coordinate with. And again, to further elevate just the role of economic development.